SBCSELPA BCBA is here today too, and he's mainly in the Santa Maria area. And I'm in Santa Ynez Valley, Santa Barbara, Carpinteria, and then Alison is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Alison, do you want to kind of share for everyone, because we do have a number of newer participants, the total number of ED programs that we have across the county?
Yeah, so we have 19 ED programs across our county. This coming year, we're going to have one in Carpinteria, and then so from Carpinteria up through Santa Maria, we have 19 programs. So this year, actually, I think it'll be 20 programs then, from age group of kindergarten all the way up through high school. So, and they're Santa Barbara, Goleta, Carpinteria, Santa Ynez, Lompoc, Santa Maria Bonita, and Santa Maria Joint Unified High School District. So lots and lots of classrooms, programs, and serving all ages, all school age kids. Anything else, Rosy, you want to add to that?
I think we can get started, and then the folks who join us. Cool. I know there's a number of people who are still in IEPs right now. They just messaged me, so we can just...
Okay, great. And I know there's some people that have to leave a little early for IEP, so we understand that you guys are all managing your time the best you can, that you have many commitments throughout the day. So we understand that. So if we see some people leaving or some people joining, that's totally fine. Remember, these are being recorded and they will be available at some point later. We still don't know when the recordings will be available, but we will keep you posted on that so you can go back and watch what you missed.
And then all the content that we're presenting in all the summit series are going to be in the manual that you will get in August when we reconvene. So there'll be a G.R.O.W 2.0 manual. There'll be an update, and it will reflect everything we're presenting here, but it's always in terms of like learning. It's good to be learning the material in a variety of formats. And really this is, even though most of the material that we're going to be presenting the entire series, with the exception of like the specific procedures from conscious discipline and the collaborative proactive solutions model, are going to be familiar to you. They're not like completely like out of the blue, you've never heard of it, but our fluency is not there. You know, even Alice and I this morning when we connected, we're talking about how she's been doing this now for 5 years, and I'm going on deep for 3 years, and it's still not something that we're fluent in, and we're still learning. So that kind of lands us on the agenda, Alison.
Yeah, so setting the stage for what we're going to talk about today. And bear with us, Rosy and I were chatting earlier and saying that it's not our normal flow, and to be separated during trainings and to not be able to see each other and tag team as seamlessly as we tried to do in person. So we're trying to do this, and I'm also doing this from the comfort of my bed. So things are just a little weird. Don't have an office in my house. So agenda, norms for our G.R.O.W learning community. So we're going to go through a few norms just to get everyone on the same page. And then we're going to talk about our learner objectives. So we're going to be addressing some narratives, which we've talked about before in previous trainings, and then go through some myth busters. And Rosy and I have our myths, and then we're also going to bring in Dr. Becky Bailey, who's going to talk about it too from Conscious Discipline. She's actually not going to talk live. We're going to watch a little video of her. Then we're going to talk about understanding more about why humans have behavioral issues, things like brain development, mirror neurons, stress and developmental trauma. I'm going to be doing some education on brain-based educational programming. And then we're going to address what we call the long game, and we'll wait till then to explain more about that. And then the most important program element of them all. So if you do leave early, you're going to miss out on that. So come back and watch the recording later, or talk to me and Rosy. All right, Rosy, you want to kick us off here with the norms?
Yeah. So with our norms, it's just important for us to establish just some ways to like work together and support each other. And yesterday, Alison did a beautiful job of kind of talking about how not just specific to like to educators and teams serving ED programs, but just across education. There's about a third of individuals that are like, yeah, this stuff totally connects. I'm ready to go dive in, right? And then there's a third that are just a little bit more hesitant and, are intrigued, and are open to learning and being challenged, but maybe are in a culture where this isn't really like the dominant way of approaching students, especially students with behavioral challenges. And then there's a third of individuals that just are not at all aligned and are really hesitant and, are just skeptical and just disagree. And we want to have a very open and transparent interaction as a community, because this is a learning community. And the bottom line is, you don't have to agree with everything that we're sharing. You don't have to be like 1,000%, I'm ready to drink the Kool-Aid. Like, if you had talked to me 5 years ago, I was on a very different path as a BCBA. And then really living in ED programs for the last 5 years, I have changed as a human being. And so we just want to make sure that we all establish that we're all learning a new language. Even Alison, who gets to spend, a big crux of her time just like literally living and breathing and learning all of this content. This is all new to us. We were not raised, with this type of approach. Our parents did not parent from this lens. And culturally, we didn't have this lens. So we have to remember this is a journey at the community level. So this experience is a community level, but also at the individual level. And we're going to be at different places, and that's totally okay. We just ask that we participate with an open mind. And if you have a difference of opinion, we just want to maintain professional decorum and understand that, like, when we're addressing differences of opinion, we're addressing the opinion and the content and not the person. And then you're going to see, throughout all of these series and the conscious discipline series, that this is about we, not about, an us or them situation. And so even in our own G.R.O.W families, all the grown-ups and educators who are committed to helping these kids, we're going to have various opinions, various tools, various triggers ourselves. But in spite of all of that, we're still a we. And so we just want to be able to emphasize that. Alison, can you do the, and then there are a couple few norms. Those of you who do PDs with Alison and I know that we love bringing in other material, and as much as we can bring other experts, or bring in the experts. We're not going to claim that we're the experts. We're really just, we're just the sieve for, putting this all together. But there's a couple of anchors that we want you to have as we're moving through this specific PD today. The first is this incredible quote by Frederick Douglass, and it says, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And there is such a depth of truth. And when you realize how long ago he said that, and that we are in 2020, and it feels like more than ever this is true. And it probably feels like it's true more than ever because we actually are having a paradigm shift. We are living in a paradigm shift. Education is going to go completely different in 20 years. Education looks different for my 3-year-old who's going to start preschool versus my 17-year-old who's going into senior year. So in 20 years, we are going to be completely aligned with mental health and wellness science. And so, but it just feels like right now there's a depth of truth to this more than ever. And then probably one of my favorite quotes of all time is this one by Maya Angelou. That says, "Do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better." And this was important for us because we, none of us are in the field of education because we are making a fortune, right? We all are in education because we do want to make a difference in the lives of other human beings. And so we easily get into the shame cycle of, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that to my student, or in our own parenting experiences, like, oh my gosh, I just totally destroyed my child, right? And that is just, it's important for us to remember that we are constantly learning especially about self-regulation that has just never been looked at systematically, and the lens has never been you're supposed to teach social emotional wellness and self-regulation just like you do any other subject. So just be kind and compassionate to yourselves.
Yeah. And just to build on that a little bit, Rosy, it's just like you were talking about earlier with, we're all learning a new language, and it's just very true. So even though we may, be learning and kind of know a little bit better, it's still just want to acknowledge that it's really hard work. Because we're learning a new language, and we're going to talk more about this as we go through. But it's hard for me with my toddler, where I know better, and yet in the moment I go back to my default settings and the way that I was raised, and I immediately have this response. And it's, as we're going to go through this, we're going to learn how to. That's okay, right? But the goal is to be conscious of that. To be conscious and notice that, oh gosh, wow, I just went to that default setting and I'm screwed up, and I'm going to try again. Right. And so then we're trying to do better. It doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight. It's going to take time for us, and it's going to take time for our kids. And like Rosy said, we all need to be patient and compassionate with ourselves and with our students. So with that, we're going to move on to our narrative building and myth busters. So I just mentioned this with the default settings. So we're going to talk about, and Rosy, you want to jump in on, well, you can jump in when you want to jump in. But what the narratives are and why we have them. So the default settings or our intrinsic biases. So knowing that we're all wired a certain way, right? Based on our upbringing, our parenting, based on our own predispositions just biologically that we have. So whether we run a little more anxious or less anxious, whether we're prone to depression or not, our own mental health things. And then we also have intrinsic biases ourselves, so biases that we aren't aware of. They're not in our conscious awareness. So knowing that we all have these, that makes us human. And it's not that we're being hard on ourselves or hard on others for these. It's just being conscious of them, being able to look at them and analyze them a little bit when we notice that we have a certain response, and kind of stop ourselves and think, gosh, what was that about? Where did that come from? Was that helpful? Was that in line with what I'm learning, what I believe is the right way to do this, right? And then Rosy, you do such a great job of talking about the brain being designed to build narratives. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, this is really one of probably the most fascinating things that I have learned in the last decade, is that literally there's so much input coming into our bodies through our brains, and that there have to be shortcuts. And so, like Alison said, our upbringing, our environment, but also epigenetic factors, like our parents' upbringing, the experience that our grandparents have get also passed on to us genetically. But the brain has to build narratives, otherwise we go nuts. And there's these really famous studies that are just, I would like to find the videos, and I haven't been able to find them, but they took individuals who had car accidents where the cerebellum, the part of the brain that allows the two hemispheres to communicate, was damaged. And so the two lobes weren't communicating anymore. And so what they did is they had the individual, close, cover one eye, and they put a plant in front of the individual, and they said, now put your keys, in the plant. And they would put the keys in the plant, and they'd say, okay, close your eyes. Now, cover the other eye and open your eyes. And they would say, why did you put the keys in the plant? So this lobe did not know, because it had been covered. It had no idea that it was the researcher who had said, previously, put the keys in the plant. And people came up with the most insane automatic responses, like, oh, the plant was lonely. Or I was worried that, I was going to forget them, and so I put them in the plant. Or they felt hot in my pocket. And then, they said, okay, you can uncover both eyes. And they reminded them, that said, hey, do you remember me giving you that, instruction? And they're like, yes. And they showed them the video of how, they came up with the answer. And they were like, well, why did I do that? And it's literally, our brains have to come up with a narrative or a schema to be able to make sense of the world. If we're not able to make sense of the world, then we just can't operate. And so this is why being, and I know it's going to sound to some of you really like new agey pop psychology, but promise that this isn't like some weird like commune like hippy dippy thing, which I got to tell you,
Rosy, nobody told you.
Which I got to tell you, 5 years ago when I first started learning this as like a very kind of traditional, I've never been a traditional behaviorist, but like I was skeptical about stuff. This is very much based in real authentic science. And so if we don't have those narratives, we fall apart. And our narratives are very much also influenced by peer conformity. Have any of you seen Brain Games on Netflix? Oh, I'm going to have to write that in the chat room when I have a chance. If you can watch, Tristan, I think you're here. You should type this in because I learned this from you. Tristan Smith was the one that showed one of the groups at Gleeta Valley. So it's a series that they have on Netflix, and there's an episode on peer conformity. And just watch it. It is absolutely mind-blowing and phenomenal. And so the whole idea that Alison said is we have to be conscious, and not in some like 1960s hippie way, but literally aware of the fact that we're designed to create narratives, and they typically aren't the best healthy narratives. So if we can just be present with that fact, then we can start training our brains to have healthier, more adaptive narratives. So, Alison, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So how adults, or how we talk about learning, how we talk about other people, school challenges that we're facing, and behavior, ours or our students, impact student engagement and classroom culture. So those narratives that we have, that Rosy's saying, that I think Tristan posted the link for that. Those narratives that we have about why our student may be behaving the way they are, even if we're not necessarily even verbalizing them where they can hear it, if we're talking with our colleagues and we're just thinking it ourselves, if it's not a healthy narrative, then it impacts our students. They pick up on that, not even non-verbally. They pick up on that feeling that we're having, that viewpoint that we're coming from about them and their behavior. And so by shifting our own narratives, we slowly can start shifting the students' own narratives about themselves. So the more that we move towards a healthier narrative and a healthier view of students and their behaviors and what may be the underlying causes and how we can support and help them, we can slowly start to shift their own narratives that they have about themselves that have been reaffirmed for them time and time and time again. So for many educators, reframing their students' behaviors as survival strategies rather than willful disobedience creates a dynamic shift in classroom interactions and behavior management. So that's in the resilience in schools. And really just, we're going to talk today about brain science, but knowing that this is something that the student's behavior is not necessarily always a choice, that it is coming from a place of through brain science. Sorry, that was my dog that was distracting me this time. Coming through a place of brain science, knowing that the students are really default settings. They have their default settings too, that they're going back to. So so some of our unhelpful narratives would be that students are in control of their choices at all times. So like I just said, not very helpful just to be telling ourselves and having them believe that they always have control. That is not necessarily true based on what we know of the brain, that it's not a choice. Sometimes it's an immediate reaction. The same things for us, that we can go back and go to our default settings so quickly that it's not necessarily a choice in the moment. We're just really going to work on being conscious of it. Another unhelpful narrative, that kids are products of their home environment, so there's little we can do at school. It's a piece, right? Our upbringings are definitely a piece of why we are who we are. However, we know through neuroplasticity of the brain that we can change that. that the brain is plastic. As kids are younger, that's a little bit more true. But as we get older, we know now that it's still true through our lifespan. It could take a little longer. It might take more repetition. However, the brain does change. So that old adage of, people don't change isn't true, right? What we need to do is be conscious and aware, and really be diligently working on the skills that we would like to acquire, and helping our students acquire the skills that they need to acquire in order to adapt or develop more adaptive behaviors, and that it is very much so possible. And we're going to be talking about this later when we talk about the long game. But I think sometimes the challenge with this is that it's kind of a learned helplessness on our part, is that it takes time. And it takes a lot of moments of interaction with kids and with teenagers, with anybody, to rewire those pathways towards more adaptive functions and more adaptive behaviors. So it's very time consuming and labor intensive, and we may not see the result of it in the time that we're working with a student. And that can be really challenging for us. It's so rewarding, and why it's so worthwhile to really note and to share when we do see that progress with students. However, we don't always get that. Another unhelpful narrative is that the child's just being manipulative. This is something that we're going to touch on throughout the series. But just thinking that, they're just trying to pull a fast one on us, or he's just working you, that's the function of their behavior, just really isn't a helpful way of understanding where that student is coming from. Another one is she's just getting away with things. So we're just letting her get away with that. If we don't have a firm consequence, or we don't have a firm, there's no punishment oriented or associated with that behavior, it's not a helpful way to think about it. Because then we do lend ourselves more towards punishment procedures. And then if we don't give him a consequence, then we are teaching him it's okay to behave that way. So again, kind of what I was just talking about, that, and Rosy, you can touch on that one if you'd like, but knowing that there's a lot of ways to teach students skills, and that just because we're not giving them a punishment doesn't mean that we're not teaching him. It doesn't mean that we're telling him that behavior is acceptable. A lot of times students know what not to do, know what the rules are, and they need a lot of our help and our coaching in order to learn a more adaptive way of behaving and navigating that issue.
I think if we were to say probably one of our biggest shifts for G.R.O.W 2.0, and where we want to encourage you, like a little teaser trailer to come to the, ongoing trainings, is that piece, is that we have historically overused the idea of using, very traditional operant shaping procedures of reinforcement and consequences as the primary modality for treating children's behavioral needs. And now science is telling us the opposite. Not that you don't use, those great tools of operant conditioning, but it can't be the primary teaching approach. And so that is going to be the biggest shift for us.
All right. Do you want to do the last one, Rosy, before we move on to the help?
In the real world, students aren't going to have all these opportunities. This is like the age-old, like, SPED versus Gen Ed debate. And and in, the real world, Gen Ed students, I always get a little defensive. This is where I have to check myself, because our SPED students have to work 1,000 times harder than, their Gen Ed counterparts. And that's not fair. That's just how, like, genetics or environment all worked out for one kid versus another. And so we just have to remember these are all filled with fallacies. And so what we want to do is really have more adaptive narratives that we focus on. And if you want to move on to that next slide, my dear. And we're going to go through these quickly because we want to, these are just kind of foundational ones that are going to influence the myth busters that we want to go over with you guys. And one of them is that sometimes more adaptive ways of looking at human development. Again, don't be thinking about this as just our ED students. Everything that we're presenting in the G.R.O.W series really should not, and Alison and I are having these conversations with leadership across the county, that this is not about ED classrooms. This is about humans. This should be the best practice approach for all human beings. And that is a direction that everything is going in terms of parenting and psychology and mental health wellness. But sometimes children can control their reactions and other times they can't. And adults are the exact same way. We've just, our brains are matured and we've developed much more sophisticated ways of behaving well at work and in the community. And then we go home and we unleash all of our crap on the people that we're closest with. Everyone avoids things that are aversive or hard for them. And this is very common for our students. So in other trainings that Alison and I've done, we've always taken kind of a survey of how often people practice their hardest things. So take 2 seconds and just think of the thing that's hardest for you. I'm going to give you an example for myself. Me, the thing that I hate the most in the universe is swimming in the ocean. So take 2 or 3 seconds. I think everybody in Santa Barbara County knows this by now. Take another second and think of something that is really, really hard for you and, you just don't really want to practice it. And then think of how often you're practicing that. And are you practicing it daily? Are you practicing it weekly, monthly, quarterly? Last year, we gathered some data on this. And it was really funny because most people were very honest and shared that they never practiced, that at most they would practice yearly. And that's just because we're grown-ups. So for me, I practice swimming in the ocean about once a decade in really warm water, like out in Hawaii or the Mexican Riviera, right? And so I'm not very good at swimming, and you can't get me in the ocean here. There's no way in hell you can get me in the ocean. So it's not just our children that avoid things that are hard. And for our kids, there are times where we share this example and staff kind of have this aha moment that going to school and struggling with self-regulation, their emotional management, and also learning, because majority of our kids struggle with work production if they don't just also struggle with just acquisition of learning. And so they're doing one of their hardest things 6 hours a day, 180 days a year for minimally 13 years. So that would be tantamount to torture for me being in the ocean. I would be like a marathon swimmer at that point. And then when people are suffering, they lash out where they feel safe. For our students, we're going to talk a little bit about capital T trauma and lowercase t trauma in a little bit. Our kids feel safe with us, so they are going to engage in those behaviors. And then we're going to talk quite a bit of this throughout the series, that disruptive behaviors have a function. They are just a form of communication. And then Alison, you mentioned that behavior change is difficult. And I would actually press it even harder in saying that we may actually never see the behavioral change we're hoping to see in our students. And it won't be until, they're in their mid to late 20s and they've reached full maturation with their brain and body that, all of the hard work that we all contribute, but we can be those adults that put them on a different developmental trajectory. And then just like grown-ups, sometimes kids have a bad day and tomorrow should be a fresh start. So we want to jump into, we have 5 myths that we want to bust, and we're going to do 3 and then we're going to pause and show this video from Dr. Becky Bailey that if you guys came to the conscious discipline modules last week, this will be a little refresher for you. And which is always great. And then if you haven't, it'll be a great little tease for you to jump into the rest of the series starting tomorrow, right, Alison? Tomorrow?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so the first myth is that it's possible to make people change. All you need to do is find the right reward and or consequence. And this is the challenge where most of us as adults, whether it be parents or teachers, this is where we end up struggling and where we end up feeling like we're failing because we're just like, we haven't found the right thing. We just haven't found the right motivator. We just haven't found the thing that would click. And we do get intermittently reinforced with this because every once in a while, when we have our self-management systems or our behavior contracts, we do find something that will work for a short period of time. And we're like, yeah, we're on the road. And then, we have some setbacks. So one of the things that as a BCBA, I will be the first person to say that our field of most fields are quite arrogant in our understanding of our own ability to affect change in others. And so, I was there. And so when I really started struggling in supporting ED programs 5 years ago, when I started working in ED programs, I really was challenged by, why am I failing? I just haven't found the right reinforcer, what additional reinforcer assessment I need to do. It just, the intervals are too long. We have to reinforce like every 30 seconds and then we'll get there. And then I realized that a lot of these misconceptions and false narratives that we have very big historical implications for us as a country, really good, dating back to how were founded, but also by the prominent leaders that shaped us, right? And so if you haven't heard of John B. Watson, he was basically the father of the branch of psychology that's known as behaviorism, which is, the branch of psychology that, if you're a behavior specialist, a BCBA, this is your cup and tea. This is your home. And so I want to share with you guys this quote of his, which I remember as an undergrad taking this class by Dr. Novak, and he quoted this. I'm like, oh yeah, this totally makes sense. And then life happened and I have been shown otherwise. But his quote is, give me a dozen healthy infants. Remember, this is turn of the century, like 1913. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-informed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race or of his ancestors. So he, in his address at Columbia University in 1913, that was a paradigm shift in American psychology. You have to understand that like Freud was a big dominant force in the universe at that time. And here come all of these researchers, like there are seismic events in world history. And the work by Watson and then all of his colleagues thereafter, and he was highly influenced by Pavlov's work, was one of those seismic events that really shaped narratives in this country about everything to do with humanity, child rearing, and education. But they also aligns very much with this rugged individualism that our country is founded on, that if you put enough effort, if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you're willing to really dig deep and do all that hard work, then you can have the American dream, right? Well, now we realize that, yes, that's true for certain classes of individuals like myself with a certain, skin tone. But it wasn't the case as a female up until like even 1970. I wouldn't have been allowed to get a credit card without my father or my husband signing off, right? So there are just narratives that are even deeper than our own personal parenting experiences and family, ideologies. And so when Alison and I were putting this together and we're really trying to find a way of helping our community come to an understanding of these really deep elements, this one kind of popped up and I thought we needed to share. So Alison, can you share what the bust is? Mm-hmm. And so if we don't find the right reward or consequence, then, I have to move this. Our brains easily trick us into thinking that either the child is flawed or choosing to be unresponsive, or us as the adults are flawed, right? So one of the things that Alison and I have done very diligently this last year is really work with admin and your directors across the county to really help them grasp that if our students have to be in ED programs long-term, that is not a sign that the program is failing and that the staff aren't doing their job, right? So we within our own county have for the last 2 years been trying to shift these narratives. And that's because we really are wired for self-preservation. And so we're more likely than not, after we have that moment of thinking we're failing, to then turn on the student and create a false narrative about the student. Alison, would you like to share anything else about this one before we move to the other one?
I just think that whenever I think about these things, I just think that they're really embedded, right? So again, just kind of coming back to that notion of having an open mind and knowing that it takes time and just being conscious of these and questioning a little bit when you find yourself either blaming yourself and thinking, gosh, that's something clearly I'm not finding that right reward or that right consequence, and that there is something out there. And I can promote that change in that student if I just find that right reward or consequence. And then if we don't, again, like Rosie's just saying, that we blame the student, right? That something's wrong with them, that they're just very manipulative. They're just an extra challenging student. They don't belong here. We go there because of our need to self-preserve. So it's just something, again, just to be aware of, and that we want to be challenging those thoughts if you notice them coming up. All right. Oh, there was one more left.
Well, this is just that
So
vicious
I just
cycle.
said that. Yeah, that vicious cycle. So unless we're just conscious of these and aware, we're going to keep coming back to it. Right. So on to our Mythbuster number 2. So the idea that rules govern behavior. So if this was true, then all the rules that we have in society, we wouldn't break any, right? We would all be, you know, complete, perfect citizens doing everything that we possibly can. You know, right now we're all isolating. We would all be, you know, we're all trying to do the best we can. And yet people are breaking rules, right? Sometimes we see the speed limit sign. I know that I don't always go 65 on the freeway, right? Like I know, and I'm was always, when I was younger, trying to be a rule following student. And yet it doesn't always work for me as an adult. And that most children learn when, where, and how to break the rules without getting caught. So even though they know what the rules are, they know the children learn how to navigate that, right? They know how to break those rules and how to get by, and to kind of work the system. So it doesn't mean that the rules are necessarily effective. They have just learned how to navigate them.
And actually, our students are the ones that, just because of all those factors that we talk about, and we're going to talk about a little bit, they're just the ones that just get caught.
They get caught. Yeah. They don't learn necessarily how to navigate it. Yeah. And they don't have the skill set to do so. Always seeking the right consequence. So what we just talked about in the previous myth, the magic bullet as the antidote to behavior. So thinking that we just need to find that right rule. We just need to make sure we teach them that rule over and over and over again, and find that right consequence to reinforce that they follow that rule, right? And that we're eventually just going to find that magic bullet that's going to get them to get it. Right. So thinking, again, just catching ourselves when we start thinking this way and noticing that that's not necessarily the most helpful way to reach our students. So we want to shift from this myth of rules govern behavior to connections govern behavior. So the better the relationship that the student has with you or other staff, other caregivers, the more that student is willing to cooperate. So it's not necessarily the rule that is going to get them to behave or the right consequence that's going to get them to reach that desired behavior. It's really always going to start with the strong, solid relationship that they have with you as the staff. Connections determine whether we abide by rules. It impacts how our brains wire pathways for self-control and willingness. And we're going to touch on this more, but knowing that, sorry, my thing's in the way here. Move you over. That this connection that we have with caregivers, that students have with you, that repetitive connection we talked about that you need over and over and over again to rewire those pathways in the brain for more adaptive behaviors, takes time, right? And that it's not dictated by the rules that you do or don't have. Did you want to add anything to that, Rosy, before we go on? No. Okay. Our last myth here, that conflict is a disruption, and that since it's a disruption, we need to stop it. So if that behavior is a disruption, that conflict, that a student isn't getting along with their peer or they're being disruptive in class, that we need to stop that behavior, right? We need to nip that in the bud. We need to get them to knock that off. We want to shift from that to conflict or behavior is a form of communication. And since it is a form of communication, then the goal is to teach a more adaptive skill. So a more healthy way of them being able to communicate what they need to communicate. And that means that they have a skill deficit in that area, and that we need to teach them a skill instead of just stop that behavior. And in future presentations, we're going to go into this in much more depth, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen that visual of like an iceberg, and that just the tip of the iceberg is the behavior, right? Just what we see. And below the surface, below the water, is so many more things that are going on, right? And our work is really below the water. Our work isn't to just stop that behavior, that's at the tip of the iceberg. It's really figuring out what's underneath it. And that's hard work. You're not, and again, we're going to be touching on this throughout the series, but as paraprofessionals, as teachers, as BCBAs, even, like, you aren't given, the mental health specialists, we're really the only ones that have the luxury of being trained as therapists, right? Me as an MFT have this background, have this training, and yet this is why we're providing you with all of this content, because you're not trained to see this, right? And to know how to respond therapeutically. It just makes me, just a side note, just makes me think of that to learn how to understand this as a form of communication, to teach those skills, is something that we're all learning how to do. All right, with that, guys, I'm going to pull up this video. So give me a sec. We're going to watch this video of Dr. Becky Bailey, and she's going to be talking about these myths. So it's about a 10-minute video. I'm going to share my screen here. So again, if you guys have watched the Conscious Discipline series, this is going to be a refresher for you. If not, this will be brand new to you. And the part we're referring to is going to start in just a few seconds.
Reflect back to your own education process. Reflect back to your own family, your family of origin. How was that for you? So I want you to want this to be a personal journey, even though I'm giving you kind of outside information. So traditional discipline, first thing, it's possible to make others change. And all you have to do is find the right consequence, the right something. If I could just figure out what that thing was, the bigger spider in the case of Miss Muffet, not the little baby spider. It says, have a good day, I need a big spider. So we believe in that it is possible. You just got to find the right reward, right? Oh, what you want, a BMW? Well, that'll work, huh? Unless you already have 4, and then you're like, I'm fine. I just think I'll walk out the door and not listen to you now. So we're trying to find the right thing. And if we don't find the right thing, guess what happens? And they don't behave. Who failed? One of us. One of us is flawed. If I can't make you behave, one of us is flawed. So either you're a bad, flawed child, or I'm a bad, flawed parent. And that's going to happen. And the ping pong will go back and forth. Often, if you tend to externalize things like I do, it will always be the child first and then me. If you're an internalizer, it'll be you first. And then after you can't beat yourself up enough, you think, well, maybe it is. Okay, I had a bad child. So how many of you have tried to make a smoker quit smoking, a drinker quit drinking, or even an 8-month-old eat peas that they didn't want to eat? How many have tried that? And how many have been successful? Well, there you go. So believing we can make others change is a fruitless effort. And again, what happens is when we attempt to make them, somebody feels inadequate. Either they're inadequate or I'm inadequate. And again, when I'm inadequate, it's a less than or a better than, and now we've started our whole life creating conflict, starting from within and creating it then from without. Reflect on it for a minute. Can this be done? Because that's what traditional discipline says. It can be done. It also, what does it teach you? It says if you find yourself in a situation where people aren't doing what you think they should be doing, you have 2 skills, blame and revenge. Now watch TV. If you don't think this is alive and well, listen to people talk. Listen to your friends talk. Listen to the teachers in the teacher's lounge talk, but watch the news. We're not, when we report the news, we're looking for who to blame and how we're going to get revenge. There's not any talk about, oh, and let's think of some solutions we could do to this big problem we're all facing. And we can't say, oh, it's the government, it's the news, It's those people in the lounge. It's my other friends that I don't hang out with much. No, it's within us. And how do we make this change? If you don't like it, start right here. And that's what conscious discipline says. It starts with me, and then it extends out to you. And that's why I am tickled you guys joined me, the ones who are going to listen, the ones who are here today, because you are saying, I'm ready. I'm ready. And I think the world, again, needs us to be ready. Okay, the traditional discipline also says, it says, one, I can make you behave. And that is actually your job, because if you don't, I'm going to stare at you at Walmart, something fierce. It also says rules govern behavior. So as soon as we get in here, we're going to talk about our rules, talk about our consequences, and we should be done with this. Now, if this is indeed true, I don't believe that we are short of rules in the United States. We had 40,000 new ones just last year. Someone in the audience is from Utah. One of them was from Utah about how or when they can drive their golf carts. Because obviously they're golf cart crazy in Utah. Most of us didn't know that, but now there's a rule for it. So since we have all the rules and we have 7 million plus people in jail in the United States, that didn't match up. So rules can't be what's governing behavior. Then we say, oh, you know what I did? I know what it is. I know what it is. It's the consequences. We haven't found the right consequences. So then that goes on the search for the magic bullet. And that's why discipline workshops are so frequently visited, because it's like I'm searching, seeking for the magic bullet. That one consequence that I can deliver that one time to this one child who will say, I'll be good for the rest of my life. Thank you for the lesson. And interesting enough, then we debate about the consequences. I know what the problem is. They're not severe enough. You know why jail doesn't work? Because they have a TV in there. Pull that TV out, we'd be good. We shouldn't even feed them. So then we spend the rest of the time debating over where that magic consequence line should be. Should it be a little more lenient, or should it be more strict? And then we forget to seek a solution. All right, so you think right now, reflect, do you believe rules govern behavior? Because if rules govern behavior, those speed limit signs aren't working for me. I'm just telling you. There's got to be something in it, because I'm still consistently going, no, I'm not even going to say that in case we have police officers watching. Or I can lie about what I drive. I drive a Honda. Okay. And the last one in traditional discipline, the third thing that's believed, is conflict is a disruption. It's a disruption to, if you're a teacher, it's a disruption to the learning of other children. This one child is keeping everyone from learning. And at home, it's a disruption to the perfect family you knew you had. We were having a perfect dinner until you were born. It's not been the same since. And the reason we believe conflict is a disruption is not because it's a disruption. See if you can follow me with this. It's because we watched it as we were growing up in our own families, and it wasn't pretty. Now, I know I watched my parents, and I watched their conflicts. Some of them were uglier than others, but what I learned as a little teeny child was avoid those at all costs, because they are hurtful. So I didn't grow up go, boy, am I committed to finding more resolutions. I grew up going, I'm committed never to have a conflict in my life. So let me see, where do you want to eat? Okay, I'll eat there. Even though I'm allergic and hate it, I'll go with you. You know, so I'm going to be a please me person to avoid them. Or tell you what, please me doesn't fit my personality. I'm going to control everything. Either you go with me and I don't care about your allergies, or that's it, I don't love you. That's the message I imply. So if you can reflect on your life, how much do you love conflict? And it's probably in the negative numbers if we're doing a 1 to 10 scale. So what else could it be if it's not a disruption? So now let's shift over and look at things a little bit differently. Would you believe if I told you, instead of conflict being a disruption, what if I told you that conflict or misbehavior is always a form of communication. Let's just let that sit a minute. That all behavior is some form of communication, even if it's what we call misbehavior. So let's go back to a baby, because a baby really demonstrates this well. So let's take the behaviors of a baby. So a baby's crying. Are they saying, oh, look, I'm trying to irritate you and keep you up all night? Or are they saying possibly, I'm hungry, I need a diaper? They're communicating. That's all they've got. That's all I got. I got crying. So I'm communicating. Oh, change me, feed me. Just pat my back a minute. I'm about ready to nod off. Or they get a little older and they go, ah, 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 ah. Are they doing that just so you can't talk on the phone? And they're saying, could you pick me up? And then you get them up on the chest and they push you and go, ah, 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 which means, can you put me down? Right? And most of us get that, right? Most of us pull that off and go, I get it, it's a communication. But then something happens between a baby and the time they can move and talk. They change on us, don't they? These are no longer communication behaviors. These are evil doings. These now are disrupting everything. So let's just push this. I want to push this with.
All right, guys, I'm going to stop her there. But, you know, she goes over the same myths that we brought up with you guys, and we're going to have a couple more that just think she does a good job of covering those. I really like that example, especially because I have a baby who's in that developmental phase right now. So, but no, and then I have a toddler who it seems like once he started talking, like, gosh, you should have control. You should know better, right? It's just these defaults that we go to and thinking that he's just, you know, he's being manipulated, just trying to get what he wants. And he knows how to ask, he knows how to do better. But in that moment, he's dysregulated. He's not able to access that skill. But somehow from the baby to the toddler, we all of a sudden think that they have a choice, that it's willful, right? Instead of just looking at it as a form of communication and a skill deficit and something that we need to work on and teach them about. So with that said, we'll go on to our number 4 myth. Rosy, did you want to say anything about that before we move on? Nope. Okay. So myth number 4, students remain in ED. Am I sharing that new screen right now with you?
No, we
Nope.
don't see the PowerPoint.
There we go. Can you see the PowerPoint now? Perfect. So students remain in ED programs versus being integrated back into gen ed quickly, then we in special ed are failing. And we talked about this a little bit already, and we talked about it yesterday, but we really want to drive home the point, not only to administrators, but to all of you, to everyone that's working so hard to support these students, is that you are not failing if a student is still struggling, if they're not able to go back into gen ed as quickly as we think they should be able to, right? We want to be thinking more that the programming needs to be individualized, and it also needs to be in collaboration with that student, really specific to that student's needs. Some students are going to come into our programs and be in our classrooms, and we're going to see this growth, and they're going to do wonderful. They're going to respond beautifully. Everything's going to be great, and they may be able to go out into a mainstream class, whether depending on what their needs are, you know, whatever that looks like. If there's a resource class available, if it's back into gen ed for that student. But some students, that's not going to be true for. Some students, it is going to take them longer. They're going to need a lot more of those moments of connection, of coaching. And that doesn't mean that we are failing or doing something wrong. So it's not a sign of team failure, and it's not a sign that this student is hopeless for this student if they're not making progress as quickly as we like to. All right, and now on to our last myth here. So not all students, we hear this a lot, that, you know, we talk about trauma a lot and we educate on trauma and how that impacts our students, and why and how it contributes to their behaviors. And what we want to talk about is that the myth that not all students in ED programs are trauma kids, and true, not all of them are what we think of in terms of like big T trauma, in terms of traditional trauma, the things like abuse scenarios. So not every student in our programs is a victim of abuse, of, you know, sexual abuse, neglect, psychological abuse. They are not all coming from that type of unhealthy family system. But a lot of them do come with some form of trauma. So there's big T trauma, and then the little T trauma results in chronic stress responses in body that mirror big T trauma. So even though they may not have experienced a big T trauma, they may have had little T traumas over time. And we're going to have slides on this moving forward, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but that now in their body mirror what big T trauma presents as. So if all students
really cool slides on that literally just show how, chronic stress and trauma, chronic stress and lowercase t trauma is tantamount. And by the time our kids come to us, we don't want our programs to be another source of chronic stress, right?
Another place where they don't belong. Mm-hmm. Right. So, all right, I'm not going to drive. We'll talk more about that as we go through. So we're going to move on now to the brain development and behavior portion. So Rosy, you want to take this part?
And so again, this focus today is really on this idea of like, we're all learning a new language of behavior, and we have to understand these underpinnings of the brain and how our bodies just are designed and how they develop. And so this is a real quick refresher that, the human brain literally develops from the back forward. But the reality is all the stuff that we love in children, like the obedience, the decision making, the impulse control, the being able to tolerate delays, all of that stuff comes from the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And that's the very last thing that develops, right? And so you've heard Alison and I share this with you, and I'm sure you've heard in a million things that you've read and learned that, the human brain isn't fully developed in women until about 23 to 24, and for men, 25, 27, right? And so when people started saying this around the time that the Affordable Care Act came out, there's a reason why adults are allowed to be on their parents' insurance until about age 26. And that's because scientists really pushed that human beings, we are the slowest maturing creature on this planet. And so it's important to just remember that the things that we're looking for in our students really are not developed until much later. And the prefrontal cortex doesn't go into its activation phase until around age 12, right? So it doesn't mean we're not teaching all these self-regulation skills, but it's not in its full cycle of, I'm really developing right now until about age 12, and it doesn't end until your mid to late 20s. The next slide, Alison. So I just wanted to share this, that how our behavioral responses shaped. So one of our like universal negative and unhealthy narratives that we have about behaviors is that people can control themselves at all times. And that is simply not true. And so there are a lot of people that, humanists and other fields of psychology that have been arguing with mainly the behaviorist side of psychology for decades. And now we actually have the technology that's able to show that neurons that fire together, wire together, and literally become the default pathway. So if you have pathways that are just, used over and over again to like respond to survival or stress mechanisms, that is going to be your default setting, right? That is why me, and those of you who I get to work with in your classrooms can testify to this, that I work really hard to absorb all of this content into my practice and now how I support your teams. But depending on how much sleep I got and whatever deadlines I have, the Portuguese Catholic immigrant default setting comes out. And you have all seen that authoritarian look on my face. It is like, I wish someone would be fast enough to videotape, because I'm sure even this year it's going to be even more interesting, because I'll go there and then the conscious part of me now has become more and more dominant, and I'm able to catch myself, even with my own husband, and we're both behavior specialists, where we catch ourselves. We're like, okay, all right, we know there's something else we're supposed to do. But the pathway of responding in that authoritarian fashion is still my default setting. So if I have any biological, neurobiological triggers my ability to use the new pathway is altered momentarily. And so this is super important that it takes direct instruction and calculated opportunities for us to practice building alternate pathways. And just look at this incredible slide. This is like pathways firing together, neural connections at the newborn, 6 months, 2 years. And you can only imagine what those look like at 7 and at 12 and at 18, right? And so it's the whole adage of use it or lose it. And it's not that we used to think that, you know, you had this window until age 5. Now we know because of technology, neuroplasticity, we can learn things at any age. I'm actually learning how to touch my toes. You know, I've never been flexible. My mother is. So these are really important for us to remember and to check ourselves when we think, up, there he goes again. He's just being manipulative. Next slide, Allison. Okay, so we want to share a couple of videos with you about how early experiences really shape default brain connections, right? So this is why Alison keeps saying to me and to all of us, the connections on the outside build the connections on the inside, right? So when those of you who have, you know, children in their 20s or 30s can really attest this to, I have a 17-year-old. And we were really taught differently how to parent when I had Teddy versus when I was in the hospital 4 years ago with my bonus baby. Now we're told, no, you don't take the baby into the nursery and give the mama a break. You're told we need to do kangaroo care and you need to have skin on skin, because we realize that those build pathways for optimal health in our babies. So take a peek and
Okay, can you guys all see that screen, the video? Okay.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
Sorry guys, if that was staticky for a minute there. All right, I'm going to bring up the other video. You all see that? Rosy, you have to unmute, hon.
I was just saying, because these things are invisible to the naked eye, we minimize the impact of all of these early connections, right? And we maximize the choice piece. And the reality is it's way more complicated in that, and those early childhood experiences and the ongoing experiences they have with us really are impacting their long-term wellness.
All right, I'm going to show this last one.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives act actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two, from eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things building sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills. An important group of skills, which scientists call executive function and self-regulation, can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport, all those planes landing and taking off, and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead, and remember and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their mind. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
All right, I'll bring us back to our PowerPoint.
I don't really think that we need to add more than that. To build like healthy, lives, we need to build healthy brains. And this is the content that we're sharing. So we want to switch gears and move into components of brain development that are really important and that we have a very immediate factor in, because it's about us and then how we at a subatomical level impact our students. So mirror neurons are like this phenomenal discovery. I believe it's like in the late 90s, but really it's not been until like the last 5 to 8 years that it's become a mainstream topic that's being explored. And so for Alison, can you go to the next slide?
Yep.
For decades, researchers, I think you have to click it 2 or 3 times. I'm sorry, I totally animated it in a funky way. For decades and decades, it's that black and white picture. Researchers understood that there was mechanisms, underlying mechanisms in the brain that lend themselves to imitation, and how imitation is foundational to learning in human beings and in creatures across the animal kingdom. And so even in newborns, in that black and white picture, you get these very quick, innate responses through imitation, right? And so not too long ago, I'm actually going to play the video and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
Okay.
Sorry, Allison.
That's okay. Sorry, just 1 second. Let me pull it up. There we go. All right, guys, give me 1 sec just to share this new video. Okay.
We are being censored.
Oh,
America's
sorry, guys.
news
I
outlets
don't have
no
the
longer
paid
provide.
subscription to YouTube.
And Joshua.
Here we go.
But when you look at the details of how these neurons, the system of mirror neurons, how it works, then the exciting discoveries unfold. So if I were studying your mirror neurons, what would happen is if I did an action that was just totally random, your mirror neurons would not fire. If I did an action which had kind of repetition to it even, you may not be able to figure out what I was intending to do after just 1 or 2 repetitions. But if I were to take an object that would signify to you what I was trying to do, like this bottle of water, just notice what your feeling is. So you may have noticed that the feeling was very different when I had a bottle in my hand versus when I was just moving my hand in a similar way. What that tells us is that when you know the intention behind an action, a different system in your brain is activated. We now know that that system involves the mirror neurons and other areas of the brain, so that what you do is you follow a sequence of action. And when you can predict that sequence, you can determine what the implication of that sequence is. So when I have a bottle in my hand, you know I will continue to drink like this, not toss it at you, for example. That ability to understand the sensory implications, that is what you're going to see, of the motor actions that you're perceiving, allows you to create a map in the mind, if you will, that's correlated with neural firing patterns in this mirror neurons superior temporal area complex that creates a neural representation, a neural map of my intention in your head. In other words, beyond just seeing behavior, we see the intention beneath the behavior from the very beginning. Now, that's how we create the human capacity to imitate behavior.
So Alison, there's another clip on that slide. If you can cue that one up while I'll talk about this.
Yeah.
You know, I love scientists, but sometimes they get into their jargon speak and I'm like, oh, you're going to lose me. But the whole point of that is, again, tying into these narratives that, you know, we're not conscious of these mirror neurons. So again, this is something that is just happening. So this is why if we are getting stressed, but we're like staying neutral, then we say, well, I was neutral and he kept escalating. Well, we really weren't neutral, right? You know, we were trying to have that like posture and the proximity and say the right things, but our body really wasn't feeling it. And Alison is going to pick up on it. Or my student Billy is going to pick up on it. Or my student Sally is going to pick on it. And that's why as we go through the training, that sometimes becoming aware of our own processes and knowing, hey, I'm going to have to tap out. I need to trade with someone because I'm not going to make the situation better.
Well, and I'm sure that you guys notice too, that this happens in your own relationships, right? I mean, I can say that if I'm in a conflict, maybe with my husband, and I say, I'm fine, because I just don't really want to deal with it in the moment. And I even say that in a non-sarcastic, very flat tone. You know, he's still picking up on the fact that this is not over. I'm not fine, right? Even if I'm acting as though I'm over it, it's fine, we're moving on. He knows that I'm not. Again, it's those mirror neurons. We're communicating through really subtle movements of our face, of our pupils dilating or not, that those mirror neurons are picking up on. Is this the video, Rosy?
I was going to say, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We actually don't have to show this video because I think we can show this one in one of the other trainings. So
Okay.
I think we can go to slide 23.
All right, let me bring it back for our PowerPoint.
So the whole point about sharing this feedback with you on mirror neurons is that our lack of skills and stress impact our students. And so we're going to use that as a segue to start talking about, childhood stress and how that impacts the developing brain. And when we're talking about childhood stress, we're not just talking about birth to age 5. We're talking about at any juncture in a child's developing, brain, how stress impacts that and how it impacts us because we're still developing, right?
Well, and Joan is commenting, Rosy, in the chat box that it's really hard during the moment when they are escalating so bad to keep it neutral. And yes, it is. It's hard for me with my own kid. And it can be hard, absolutely, with our students. And we're going to be talking about that a lot in this G.R.O.W series, is about our own stuff that we have, and what that goes back to our narratives, it goes back to our upbringing, goes back to all of our default settings too, and the importance of us being aware of that and conscious of that, and just making the effort to really calm ourselves down, to really stay regulated as much as possible, and not only to act neutral, but to really feel calm and be able to be present in the moment with that student. Is the ultimate goal, and it's challenging, right?
And Joan, just to piggyback on what you shared in the chat, the reason it's hard to stay neutral is because our mirror neurons are firing with that child. And so we're responding at a subatomical level, and that's why stress is contagious. So, Alison, we can move to the next series of slides. So do you want to differentiate between traumatic stress versus chronic stress?
And I noticed somebody too put in the comments that it's good to differentiate too between healthy or good stress and bad stress, which would be the traumatic or the chronic stress. Because yes, stress in general, there is the good stress that motivates us, right? Just like a certain level of anxiety is healthy because it motivates us to do something when we need to, right? It gets us to accomplish something. If we're feeling that low level of anxiety, it's when it reaches that toxic level that it no longer becomes healthy. So to differentiate, just to give you some definitions, with traumatic stress, so is a trauma or a blow to the system from an exceptional experience that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. So the response to trauma is often a sudden social, emotional, or behavior change, or an increase in negative behaviors. Versus chronic stress, which would be a long-term exposure. So something that happens repeatedly over time to risk factors that could result in chronic stress. So the long-haul chronic stress often results in hypervigilance, which sometimes can be misdiagnosed as ADHD, when students are constantly not able to sit still, right? And not able to focus on anything because they're constantly scanning their environment. They're in that survival state all the time. Or a learned helplessness or an apathy, where their system has really just shut down as a response to that chronic or repeated trauma or stress over time. Do you want to add anything, Rosy? All right. So we have these sources of chronic stress, which could be, because they're not just, again, like we talked about the trauma that we normally refer to, but some sources of chronic stress, so that stress, repeated stress over time, could be experiencing neglect, abuse, or trauma. It could also mean being told what to do, but not how to do it. So having these rules and expectations, and that you're just expected to abide by them, and yet you've never been taught the skill in order to do so. And that can result in chronic stress because you're constantly failing, right? You're constantly not getting it right. And that results in chronic stress. Economic, social, and health insecurity. So if you don't have access to basic needs, food, water, shelter, not getting that social interaction, the healthy social interaction, or having health insecurity, so having chronic health issues, or being with in an environment with caregivers that also have health issues.
I know many of you have attended Alison's ACEs trainings, but one of the factors that comes up is that many of our families, many of our students that are in our classes have families that have to work 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs in order just to make ends meet and live, in Santa Barbara County, or just live in the United States at this point. And so their kids are deprived from having those healthy, loving interactions that really the developing brain and body need to have. Being labeled a minority or an out group has chronic stress. Staff with poor cultural responsiveness. So, not being understanding of, children's individual microsystems and their own cultural impact to how they respond. And then micro aggressions, being judged by skin color, expressions, or neighborhood. If we haven't experienced those, we tend to discount those. And the research is very clear that those microaggressions have lasting physiological change on people's brains and bodies.
And Rosy, Lauren's asking in the chat that if we know how to differentiate between true ADHD versus hypervigilance in a school assessment, the difference between qualifying under OHI versus ED or something else. And I think that's a very complicated issue, Lauren. I think that it's something that Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris talks about in her book, and also in the movie Resilience, if you've ever seen that. And she's a physician that is very knowledgeable about this, and she does assessments in this. So I can't give you a really quick answer that yes, we know how to do that. I know we don't at this point. It would require, I think, a workup from a physician who's very knowledgeable about trauma and toxic stress and how it affects the developing mind and body to be able to differentiate that.
There's a lot of research being done on this, and a blue panel committee will probably in about 2 years, depending on what happened with COVID, is going to actually start doing, just like they do autism screenings at well baby visits, they are almost ready to launch doing ACEs screenings at well baby visits. So that work will improve diagnostic ability. It will trickle down eventually.
And it's already happening in our community. There's pilot projects happening I know there's a clinic in Isla Vista, for example, a pediatric clinic where they've already started that over a year ago in conjunction with CALM. So it's happening in our community, but we're not there yet. All right.
So some chronic effect stress and some effects of chronic stress, which again, this is important for us to know as a learning community so that we can use hopefully this knowledge to counter our default judgments of our students. So true or false, chronic stress accelerates aging. Yep. Being in close contact with stressed people increases your stress levels. Mm-hmm. Stress impairs self-control. More and more, there is a ton of research coming out documenting how that is a huge factor in self-regulation. Stress impairs memory, 100% true. The hippocampus, the part of the brain that processes memory, is smaller in people who have experienced chronic stress over a 5 and 10 year period. And the longer the exposure to to chronic stress, not trauma, chronic stress, the more impact these parts of the brain are. And then dwelling on stressful events increases inflammation in the body. So how many of us right now are achy and, sciatica is triggered and you can't sleep? Well, that's because our chronic stress is taking a toll on our bodies.
And this is what, we've already mentioned the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, but this is what leads to long-term negative health outcomes, right? Because it doesn't just affect us in terms of our mental health, being exposed to chronic stress, it also affects us on our bodies, right? So increasing that inflammation, it affects our physical health as well, too. So we've already kind of touched on this, but that poverty is a significant source of stress. So again, our students may not be trauma kids, but that they are experiencing this chronic stress if they may be of low socioeconomic status or exposed to a situation where poverty is an issue for them or their family.
So with low SCS children, so this is socioeconomic status, those students are exposed to more stressors, more intense stressors, longer lasting stressors, and have fewer coping skills than their high SES or even middle class counterparts, right? So take a second as you leave today and think of the students in your class. And this is where we get that myth of, well, not all kids in an ED program are trauma kids, so they don't need a heavy therapeutic social emotional program. They're just more conduct kids, or they're more just like, just, I don't know, whatever narrative people have, but that's not the case. So in low SCS kids, stress indicators are 17% higher than for non-poor students. And then this is just a really good visual. There's a couple of visuals right here of what happens with the repeated exposure of stress triggers in the brain. There's different neurochemicals that get released, and guess what happens? Those become the default pathways in the brain. So instead of it being at 0 every time they encounter a stress or a stressing event, they're already up here. So this becomes the trap of, well, our classroom is safe. We're not triggering them, but it's not just about what we're doing in the moment with them. It's everything else that's going on physiologically. And that's why sometimes teams will say to us, but it was just out of the blue and the response didn't match, the trigger. Well, it didn't match the trigger because there is a complete mismatch in that child's physiology, but it didn't come out of the blue because all of these other factors are impacting that child's body from being able to respond in a neurotypical way. So bottom line for today, the walk-away message is these are not neurotypical students. If a student ends up in an ED program, they are not a neurotypical student. So here are some just slides that show again like what the brain of a healthy 3-year-old and then what the brain of a child who's had repeated chronic stress. So you can see that there's a shrinkage and their ability to develop those short-term memories into long-term memories gets compromised. And so when we're trying to teach skills, this is why we become frustrated with our students, because they've been in our programs for years and yet they're still not using their replacement behaviors fluently. Well, now, first of all, that's a misnomer. That's just part of human development. And second of all, if they are coming from an environment that's impoverished with stress in any way, we wouldn't expect it, right? And in 15 years, there's going to be like a little machine that we all walk in and, as many times as we want, it's not going to be expensive. And it's going to be able to give us a profile of how our brain is operating. And then we'll be able to like modulate how we do intervention and instruction. But until then, it's really important that as a learning community, we are aware of that, right? So that prolonged stress experiences just change the physiology of the brain. So what happens is this impacts acquiring new skills, period. Regulating stress, memory, and attention. We kind of talked about this. Here are a few brain scans on, it's not CT scans, I'm totally like drawing Dr. Aumann's research. Oh my goodness, it's a specific type of scan. And so what it shows is like, what was that?
An fMRI?
No, it's not the fMRI, it's a different one. I'm totally blanking, it'll come to me in a second. But this is what an optimal like prefrontal cortex will look like. This is the brain of someone who's had chronic repeated stress, not someone who's watched, their mother be murdered, right? Not someone coming from a war-torn country, just chronic repeated stress. So this is why eventually repeated stress does become traumatic. So very different outcomes for individuals with these two types of brains, right? So additional factors, Alison, you kind of want to talk a little bit about additional factors?
Just to build on what we've already talked about. So we have touched on ACEs already, to things of developmental trauma, chronic stress. I know with my own son with developmental trauma, he was born early. He was really small. We didn't know. He was in the NICU for a few weeks, and I've been talking with Rosy about this, and that he's wired a little bit differently, because in utero, in the development, he was in a stressed out situation because he wasn't getting the nutrients that he needed. And so his little brain and system is wired differently. And so he does struggle with impulse control issues. I mean, he's 4, every kid does, but more so than others. So knowing that about him and knowing that he's going to need more, right? More assistance, more help, more compassion, chronic stress, learning disabilities, neurochemical imbalances, mental health challenges. So a lot of our students that are coming into our programs have a lot of these different sprinkling of things that contribute to their physiology now, that then contributes to the way that they're communicating their needs with us.
So Alison, Chris remembered the name of the type of
great.
It's SPEC imaging.
SPEC imaging, that's what it is. Good job, Chris. Nice. All right, so I was just talking about this developmental trauma, but that you can see how the pyramid gets flipped, that in typical development, kids aren't stuck in that survival state very much, that there can be more in that cognition phase, a lot more, a place of their brain a lot more, and being able to learn more and take in new information. Whereas a kid who may have had more trauma or issues in their development, that they spend most of their time in their survival state, right? And more time in trying to regulate their system and their emotions, and very little time in the place of their brain where they can take in new information and process that and learn from it and make a different choice, right? So they're in that they're part of their brain a lot less.
So we need to understand, what can we do? And so we have to understand that brain integration is the ultimate goal of everything we do with our students. So optimal health functioning comes from, optimal brain functioning comes from brain integration. And so what we can actually do on a day-to-day basis is learn evidence-based strategies that are going to lend for building those opportunities for healthy pathway development integration. And 2 strategies we're going to talk about now are co-regulation, attunement. And so Alison, if you can move to slide 39, I think it's 2 from here. We don't have to do these 2. We've already kind of touched upon them. Okay, so do you want to explain attunement?
Yeah, so attunement is a process of being aware and responsive to one another. So being aware of what may be contributing to the behavior and responding appropriately, being in that moment with the student. It's being present and attuned. So being in relationship with that other individual. So we all need that feeling and get that feeling of like, gosh, this person really gets me, right? Like you connect with that person at that level, like they really understand me. That's what we mean by attunement. So being able to be that connected. Yes.
So the reason that people get that, oh, she just gets me feeling, it's from the mirror neurons.
Right.
And so, and it's the process of attunement.
Yes, absolutely. So if we lack attunement in early infancy and childhood, disrupts that brain development. So if a child doesn't have that attunement with a caregiver in their development, then that does disrupt, as we've been talking about, their brain development. So relationships that aren't highly attuned do suffer. And Rosy, I did not queue up this video. Would you like me to show that?
No, we're going to actually save it for the next sessions.
Right.
And you guys, we're going to be going through, how do we attune? How do we co-regulate with our students? The takeaway message of attunement and co-regulation is that we do this in our most precious relationships. So when we think about, our most treasured friends, it's people who attune to us and who co-regulate with us. So Alison, if you can move to page, to slide 41.
And the reason why we're really sharing all this with you is that this is the underpinnings of G.R.O.W, right? Of the interventions and the program elements that we're going to be talking about. This is the science behind it. This is why we're going to be talking about some of the strategies that we do because of this research and information. So setting the stage for future presentations. So if we're not able to do that attunement, if we're not able to really be present and in the moment and really working on getting our students and understanding the intent behind their behavior, maybe where they're coming from in that, then it's really going to be impossible to co-regulate with them, to effectively coach them. And being an attuned educator, so meaning, and we're going to go into this a lot, that we must be conscious of yourself and of your students. So it's not just focusing on the student and their needs, it's really focusing on ourselves too, of what's going on with us, right? And how can we regulate our system so that we can then lend that skill to our student and be present for them in the way that they really need us to be, in a non-judgmental place, to create that felt sense of safety and connection that they need in order to regulate their system, so that we can co-regulate with them, calm them down so that they're able to access those higher levels of the brain and learn a new, more adaptive skill.
So we've been already alluding to what co-regulation is. So we understand what co-regulation is, like Dr. Bailey said, with babies, right? And it's imperative those first 6 to 9 months that caregivers are attuned and are co-regulating with their babies. Otherwise, you hijack brain development. But grown-ups use co-regulation all the time. That's like, we're texting our friends, we phone a friend, we use a variety of mechanisms with the people that we trust and hold dearest to co-regulate. And it's a necessary part of childhood and adolescent development. And just like we said in the beginning, we're going to be switching how we're looking at behavior, that all behavior is a form of communication. And instead of looking at it as a disruption, when we look at it as a form of communication, then we understand we have to co-regulate our students with those specific strategies.
And the idea too behind with co-regulation is that this is why we don't send students to a corner and say, pull it together, right? Get it together, calm down, and do that on your own, and then return when you're ready, right? It's why we're really working on this attunement and driving home the point that we need to really focus on regulating ourselves and coach students, that these are teaching opportunities.
Alison, you always give the example that was kind of my aha moment, that if a student was having a difficult time learning to read, we wouldn't time them out and say, all right, when you're ready to read, you pull it together, right? We would think that we were nuts by doing that, right? But yet we think that when it comes to behavior, we just have to have the right consequence, and then they're going to be able to operate. And now we're realizing that fundamentally their brains are at a massive disadvantage, and we have to co-regulate with them in order to bring them out of those cycles.
Do you want me to fast forward through this?
Yeah, I think we could actually move to the next one, to the 45, so how to co-regulate. And we're going to go into real concrete details. Don't be worrying about this, of how to co-regulate. Go back up. Yeah, so providing warm, responsive relationships, structuring the environment, and then teaching and coaching those regulatory skills. That is going to be foundational to the strategies we're going to share with you from conscious discipline and collaborative proactive solutions. So the last thing I think we want to say here, and then we're going to wrap up, is that there's this neurobiological cycle of behavior that is invisible. So look at this image here. There's an invisible neurobiological cycle of behavior that is not 90% about choice. So remember, your take-home message today is that choice is really before the behavior. Choice is in us choosing to teach our students the skills that they are missing and addressing those underlying communicative needs that their behavior are really just a red flag for, okay? And then Alison, I think we can move to the long game slide, because they've been dying to hear this one.
Yeah. So the long game. So we really need to calibrate our expectations and remember the following things. So all human brains and bodies are designed for safety and self-preservation. we're all developing, and for many, not in a very linear path, right? We're all over. In our it's not just a really pretty graph. Multiple factors influence our ability to self-regulate and manage challenges in schools. We've been talking about all these things: brain development, mirror neurons, and trauma. And that genuine cooperation comes from connection, not from fear-based strategies. And really, with the long game, the biggest thing that I want you guys to take home is that this takes time. I mean, that's really what I mean by the long game, is that the interventions that we're going to talk about and all of this science that you're learning about today, and these changes in the brain and creating those new neural pathways with the nerves that fire together, wire together, that isn't something that after just 3 or 4, 1,000 experiences, okay, we got it. It's solidified, right? You saw that video where those connections are being strengthened and then the other ones are dying off. And we're literally creating new ones, new buds that we're pruning, and we're constantly trying to shape in a more adaptive way. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of repetition. So what we talked about earlier, where we may not see the benefit of all the work that we're doing, of us really trying to teach these students these new adaptive skills, we may not see the benefit of that in the time that we're working with the students. Like Rosy said, with some of us, it may not be till we're, they're in their early 20s where we see that benefit come. Really, all we can do is learn what we're learning, put it into practice as much as we possibly can, and know that we're doing the right thing, that this is what this student needs at this time. And we're doing the best we can, and that this is going to have benefit to them, and we just may not see it. And that can be really hard. But I just want you guys to know that doesn't mean that you're not doing your job if you don't see the benefit in the time that you have with your student, right? You're still helping them in their trajectory in the right path.
I think the trap for us, Alison, is if we're not effortly putting a lot of focus in changing the way that we think, we're going to think, oh, it's just the program doesn't work. He needs a more restrictive setting. He just needs to go to a non-public school, right? If he just went to a wilderness camp. And the reality is that this is evidence-based practice for all human beings, but especially for our kids.
And there is no quick fix.
No.
There is no quick fix. There's no quick way to rewire pathways for long-lasting change. I mean, maybe, like we said, you might, if you give a kid a very structured, system, environment where they have the same structure all the time, and you may get them to comply, and it may seem like it's working. However, remove that environment, put them back out and say the real world, and you're not going to see that be able to continue in the same way, right? Because those systems weren't rewired diligently.
And that's why our students resist being pushed back out into gen ed, and because their bodies literally are telling them they're not ready, right? They don't have, those pathways set up.
A strong enough skill set. So the most important program element, so we're here now, and the big spoiler is that it's us, right? So the biggest program element is us, the adults in the classroom. That is the most important thing, is us being able to challenge our narratives, to be aware of our own biases, and to keep thinking, gosh, why did I respond the way that I did? Was that helpful? With all the things that I'm learning and what I know now, was that an intervention that was really helpful for that student? Was I practicing on being attuned? Did I think about the intent perhaps behind that behavior and understand it more as he's communicating rather than misbehaving, right? So this quote from Maya Angelou, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. That quote is very comforting to me when I mess up as a parent, which I do all the time, is that, I may not get it right every single time with my kids. However, they know that they're loved, right? They know that I think the world of them and think they're the most precious person on this planet, right? As their mother. And so it's really how we make our students feel that we love them, we care about them, we're invested, right? We may not get it right all the time, and that's okay. It's really how we make them feel about themselves, that they're wanted, they're cared for, they're seen. You want to do this one, Rosy?
Yeah, and to wrap up for today, here are a few things to kind of just keep in the back of your mind as you're processing all of this is, again, behavior influences behavior. It's not just everything that is observable, right? Those mirror neurons and, you know, all of the neurobiological components that impact our bodies and our brains are not just equally, and science is telling us they're more important than, you know, the outward things that we're seeing, right? It's not just, I don't want to do the math page, it's everything else that's going on underneath that. So we really need to just not just pretend that we maintain a calm expression demeanor, but we actually have to embody it, which means you're going to all learn this year when the kids are beginning to trigger, we're all going to be modeling that, and the kids are going to think we're nuts, right? You should have seen me a couple days ago, and I was about having a panic attack. I'm like, I should have had a camera on me. I'm in the backyard going, it's not working. Alison, it's not working. Like, I want to call her. I'm like, it's not working. And then eventually, like, my body was able to calm down. I was able to go back and do what I needed to do. But we have to actually model and embody that. And we can't control others. We can only facilitate and coach. And this is what the whole process of attunement and co-regulation is about. So when our students are struggling, we can offer help, we can listen, we can coach, but we can't add demands, right? And then tomorrow we're going to, and not tomorrow, next week, we're going to start really sharing a lot of these components of how we maintain safety in our programs. And I think for myself, because a lot of times I live in the world of the escalation behaviors, it's really learning how to give our students and ourselves a way to opt out way before those behaviors start coming up. So, like we said, it's all about us. We need to be the change that we want to see in our kids.
So this is a lot of the researchers that we're drawing this information from. So you saw a video by Dr. Becky Bailey. You saw one by Dr. Dan Siegel. We may in future trainings show you some of the work of Bruce Perry or Dr. Brian Harris. And some of these slides we were loaned from the Brain and Learning Conference that this year. So just want to thank all of these wonderful researchers that do amazing, amazing work. And so this is a lot of the work that we're drawing from for G.R.O.W 2.0. So with that, guys, that's our last slide. So thank you guys for being with us today. We will be resuming our G.R.O.W Summit next week. So next Tuesday will be our third in the series of 8 sessions for our G.R.O.W Summit. Next week, the third one, we're going to be talking about the differences between G.R.O.W 1.0 and G.R.O.W 2.0, and we're going to be highlighting the program elements that we are no longer keeping and why, and then what we're going to be moving towards. So what are some of the ones that we're going to be maintaining and building on in the future to kind of lay that foundation. And then the one on Wednesday, number 4, is going to be going over in a lot more depth those program elements and program interventions. Okay. Thank you, guys. We can stick around for a few more minutes if anybody has any questions, any feedback. We're always open to that. Thank you for being here. We hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.